The years that Bullock got in trouble, the ADL spy, the way he was caught, he would come to a meeting like this, he'd sit down, he'd go out in the parking lot, and he'd take the license plates of all the cars in the parking lot. And then he would take the license plate numbers. Here's a list, Tom, to Tom Gerard of the Police Intelligence San Francisco. Would you get me the names of these people? And back would come the name and the address of the people that owned that car and a notation. These people are anti-Israel, or they're pro-Palestinian, or they're peacemaking on the war in Vietnam. And that information would then be funneled to the Los Angeles office of the ADL, to the New York office of the ADL, to the Washington, D.C., and to whatever local office was involved. Portland, Oregon might get it. The 31 major cities, including Tel Aviv, with offices of the ADL, were on constant communication, and they built up these dossiers so that if you wanted to call and find out if a person was anti-Israel or had ever said anything that was anti-Israel, you call this number, the guy on the line in Los Angeles, 30 seconds later he can come back and say no or yes, which would condemn you. Well, I had spoken out against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the use of cluster bombs. I had been known as a relative friend of Israel up till that time. The Jews quite often had views that I shared on issues like Vietnam or women's right of choice, things of that kind. But once I took one position that was deemed hostile to the state of Israel, I was a marked man. I came back and ran for the Senate in 1982. I'd been in the House 15 years. And let me tell you what happened. I'll give you 3 examples. My finance chairman in Southern California was a savings and loan executive. He was a very loyal man. He'd known my father. He wanted to help me. He thought I'd make a good senator. There was a savings and loan crisis in 1982, you may remember. 3 of his biggest Jewish depositors came to him and said, Mr. X, we see you're the chairman of this finance committee. You get off that committee, or we will withdraw our deposits. See, now you have the coupling of economic power. Advertisers. If a radio talk show or a television talk show indicated sympathy with the Palestinian cause, the station would be deluged with calls. This man's anti-Semitic. Any comment. The threat of anti-Semitic Semitism, as you know, in the academic community, nobody wants to be called a bigot or anti-Semitic. But the ADL in this period of time, you've seen the new books, the new anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism. And no longer is this Jewish political, the liberal political thought of the 30s. Now the support of Israel is the primary obligation of every Jew. You're not a good Jew unless you are speaking out for Israel or doing your part to defend Israel against unjust criticism. When I left the Congress, I lost that Senate race to Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson, the Republican, went up to San Fernando Valley and made a promise to the Jewish leaders of that highly powerful Jewish area that if elected to the Senate, he would favor the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. That story was reported and absolutely hushed up. You've never heard the story since. The Jewish community has the power to suppress, either by advertising or control of the media, stories that are hostile to Israel, and they have the ability to discredit anyone who speaks out. And that's their purpose. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what they've done to friends or clients of mine. And you'll recognize this goal to preserve a good public opinion of Israel. In 1983, 2 young women that were wives of Arab professors at San Jose State and the University of California, Carol Al-Shaib and Audrey Shabbos, had a little educational program to try to educate people about Muslim culture, Arab culture. And they would put on seminars and they would teach people about the history of the Mideast. They quickly came under the eye of the ADL as being threatening to Israel because they were speaking of justice for Palestinians. They entered into a contract when the Saudi art exhibit came to San Jose. It was going to be hosted by the San Jose Art Museum Foundation, I believe was the name of it. It was run by 21 leading citizens. The chairman happened to be Jewish. Carol and Audrey were going to put on 2 speakers, a lady from Texas who had spoken for Palestinian rights, One of the members of the board thought he'd heard the name, and he called the local ADL representative, a Professor Brenner, up at the University of California, famous professor. And Brenner said that those people are anti-Israel. The two women had invested about $5,000 to put on this sort of 4-day expression. They'd sent letters out to all school teachers. They were called up in front of the board and told them that they were going to have controversial speakers and they were going to cancel this. Well, these are two women that are going to make $15,000 off a seminar and probably pay half of $10,000 of it in expenses. But the ADL had effectively ended their ability to earn a living in teaching people about the Arab world. The second issue, I know some of you don't like Willis Carto, but I want to tell you a story. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, a ship called the USS Liberty was sailing off the coast of Egypt and Gaza. It was outside the 3-mile limit, well outside. It was a radio antenna ship. You can call it a spy ship, but it had all the modern antenna. It was like the Pueblo that was taken off Korea a few months later. It had a crew of 295 people and officers, commanded by Captain McGonigal. In the early morning of that day, they had a big American flag, and a fellow named Jim Ennis, who was a lieutenant officer of the deck, ran up the big American flag, something that was so big you could see it for 5 miles. They were surveilled by a flight of Israeli jets, not once but twice. And finally, in the early afternoon, the jets roared in and strafed and machine gun, knocked out all of the antenna. Torpedo boats came out from the Israeli coast, launched a torpedo. Nearly everybody on deck was killed or wounded. Out of a crew of about 295, my recollection is that there were 35 killed, something like 194. The greatest casualties on a U.S. naval ship since the slot at Guadalcanal. The ship started to go down. They put out lifeboats. The Israeli boats machine-gunned life rafts. They intended that there be no survivors. Oh, they said it was a terrible mistake. We really didn't see the American flag. We didn't know. Well, as people have examined the history of that, people have come forward and said, I was in the headquarters on that day. I was a Naval Reserve officer. Yeah, they knew it was the U.S. Liberty. It had a big American flag on it. They bombed it, strafed it deliberately. Well, the ship limped back to Malta. Captain McGonigal was able to save the ship, buried the dead, took the wounded, and gave the instructions that the crew was to be separated. No one person was to go to the same base. They spread them out over ships and stations all around the United States. They were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, but they were never told about it. Captain McGonigal was later given the Congressional Medal of Honor for saving the ship, but he's the only Congressional Medal of Honor winner in history to get it at the Washington Navy Yard and not at a ceremony in the White House. That story was suppressed for years and years. Finally, Jim Ennis wrote a book called The Assault on the Liberty. Suddenly, the copies of the book started disappearing from libraries. Clearly, there was some effort afoot to keep Jim Ennis' story of the Israeli attack on the Liberty silent. Well, there's a little town up in Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee, called Grafton. And there were two old gentlemen. I've got to remember their names. Grobe. Ted Grobe and marvelous. Was it Henry? Anyway, Ted Grobe was one of them. The Grobe had been immigrants from Germany at the end of the last century. They'd set up a machine tool shop in the town of Grafton, which is a town of about 20,000. And when Grafton was in trouble in the Depression, the Grobes could be counted on to help out. They were good people. They were quiet people. They were German. They had taken the brunt of Germany's becoming the enemy of the United States in 1917. A lot of the German language newspapers in Wisconsin were in favor of the Kaiser. Why get into that war in favor of Britain and France? It was not our war. It didn't seem to be a war in which there was a whole lot involved for the United States until the Lusitania was stunk and public opinion turned against Germany. And Germans from that time forward were suppressed because they clearly, the Kaiser and the Huns and American over their expeditionary force. But the Groves plotted ahead. Their business was the most successful in the little town of Grafton. And in 1993, Grafton, unlike most towns, which they're letting their libraries go, and you can get video television anywhere you want, but try to find a library that's being supported politically. The good people of Grafton, it's south of Green Bay, if you've ever watched the Green Bay Packers, they're all Packer fans, decided they want to build a library, and so they called in a professional consultant. And if you ever build a YMCA or a Boy Scout thing in your school, there's a plan. You get a pro. And the pro comes in and he says, you need $2.5 million. Okay, you've got to raise the first $250,000, 1/10 of it. You've got to raise it from one person. You've got to start it off so people have hope that they can get the full $2.5 million. And so the first gift has got to be $250,000, and then ideally you get 5 gifts of $50,000, and then you go out publicly, and on the town square you have a big thermometer. And as you get closer and closer to your goal, the thermometer goes up, and people get inspired, and finally you put it over the top. And the good people of Grafton said, well, how do you get that first $250,000? And the pro says, well, it's simple. You name the library after whoever gives you the $250,000. So the Grove brothers, Ted and his brother, give the first $250,000. And they proceeds, and finally, a year later, they've got the $2.5 million, and they're going to have the groundbreaking for the library, and the town citizens go to the Grove brothers, and they say, would you like it named the Ted Grove or the Melvin and Tel Grove Library or Hanson? No, these guys had been reading the Spotlight. Terrible Spotlight. Spotlight used to pillar me regularly about every third issue if McCloskey was a communist or against the war, against Nixon, all of the bad things. Carter was no friend of mine editorially. But the Spotlight had picked up the story of the Liberty. And so they asked the Grove brothers, want it named the Grove Memorial Library? No, sir. We want it the USS Liberty Memorial Library. Well, all hell broke loose. The ADL went right up the wall. And they got editorials in the Milwaukee Journal, the Chicago papers. They had just dedicated the Golda Meir Library, I think, down in Chicago, but by God, this was anti-Semitic. To criticize Israel, an American ship that had 35 killed, one of them was Jewish, incidentally, in that crew, and 195 wounded, it was anti-Semitic to name a library after a U.S. ship that had been torpedoed and strafed by the Israeli. It would raise all of the things of anti-Semitism. They got about a third of the teachers of the high school to condemn naming the library the USS Liberty. They got the valedictorian, a young 17-year-old, to get up and speak in the graduation speech against naming the library the USS Liberty Library. And all of this was sponsored and thrust by the ADL because of this incredible fear that somehow there would be public opinion against Israel by raising this issue. And that's what you're up against. And I don't know whether you're right or wrong in the Holocaust, but any position where any historian takes a position against Israel is going to bring down the wrath and the concentrated both numbers and economic power that they can have to do it. I'll tell you another story about a friend of mine named Ivor Davies, Norman Davies.